The fog had not yet lifted from the hollow when Cordelia Wren let herself in through the servants' gate, her breath rising in pale clouds, her boots silent on the frost-hardened gravel. Ashworth Hall slept behind its tall windows, dark and enormous, the kind of house that seemed to hold its silence the way other things held their heat. She liked it best at this hour, before the household stirred, before anyone could look at her and decide, in the space of a glance, exactly how little she mattered. At dawn, the house belonged to her alone. It was the only hour of her day that did. She crossed the east lawn with her basket of rags and beeswax, her shawl drawn tight against a cold that bit through wool as though it were muslin, and did not see the man standing at the edge of the yew hedge, still as a carved thing, watching her the way a man watches something he has forgotten how to name. He had arrived in the night, unannounced. His carriage left half a mile down the drive so that no lamp would betray him, no groom would come running with the ceremony he could not yet bear. He had wanted, for one morning, to be nobody. He had wanted to walk his own land without the weight of what his name did to people's faces. He had not expected to find a girl already awake in it, moving through the grey light as though she owned some quiet and ancient claim to it that no deed could grant. Cordelia let herself in through the scullery door and lit the banked coals in the kitchen grate, her hands moving through the motions with the ease of 5 years' repetition. She was 21, though the house often treated her as though she were both younger and older than that at once. Young enough to be ordered about like a child, old enough that no one troubled to soften the orders. She had come to Ashworth Hall as a girl of 16, the daughter of a bailiff who had died owing more than he had ever earned, and she had learned quickly that gratitude, once accepted, could be collected upon indefinitely. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, liked to remind her of it. So did nearly everyone else. She did not know, as she knelt to lay the fire, that the man from the hedge had followed the sound of the door and now stood in the passage beyond the kitchen, half in shadow, watching the play of firelight catch gold in her hair before she twisted it back beneath her cap. She did not know that the man watching her had a name that made bishops incline their heads and mothers with unmarried daughters go pale with hope. She knew only that when she rose and turned toward the corridor with her basket, there was a stranger standing in it, tall and travel-worn, wrapped in a plain grey coat with mud upon its hem, and that her heart gave one hard, undignified lurch of fright. "You gave me a fright," she said, before she could think better of speaking so plainly to a man she did not know. "The house isn't open to visitors before 8, sir. If you've business with His Grace's steward, you'll want the estate office, not the kitchens." He said nothing for a moment, and in that moment she took him for exactly what his coat suggested. A land agent, perhaps, or a new man come about the horses, someone with dust on his boots and no great claim on her deference. It did not occur to her that a duke might arrive at his own house looking like a man who had slept in a hedgerow, because it had never once occurred to her that a duke might want to. "Forgive the hour," he said at last, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man accustomed to weighing his words before he spent them. "I did not mean to startle you. I am new to the house, come to look over the grounds before the family returns. I did not think anyone else would be about so early." "Someone is always about this early," she said, some of her fright softening into the dry humor she kept, mostly for herself. "The fires don't light themselves, sir, whatever the family may believe." She regretted the words the instant they left her. One did not speak so freely to strangers, and certainly not to strange men in strange houses at strange hours. But he did not look offended. He looked, if anything, faintly and helplessly amused, as though she had said something he had wanted someone to say to him for a very long time. "No," he agreed, "I don't suppose they do." He gave his name as Mr. Ash. It was not strictly a lie. Ashworth had been shortened by generations of servants' tongues to Ash long before he was born, and he told himself, standing there in the grey kitchen light, with the girl's clear eyes fixed on him, that he had not decided anything yet. He had only wanted for 1 hour not to be watched the way he was always watched, weighed, assessed, angled toward. He wanted to know what a house looked like when no one in it was performing for him, and already, in the space of 4 sentences, he understood that he had found exactly that, and that he was not at all ready to give it up. Cordelia showed Mr. Ash to the estate office because it seemed the safest place to put a stranger she could not account for, and did not think of him again until she found him, an hour later, in the long gallery, studying the portraits with an attention she found faintly absurd in a man who was, by his own account, only newly hired. "You've a strange way of looking over the grounds," she said, coming upon him there with an armful of linen. "Unless the grounds have taken to hanging themselves on the walls." "I like to understand a house before I understand its land," he said, and did not turn from the portrait he was studying, a stern, handsome woman in blue silk, dead some 40 years, whose eyes seemed to follow the room the way certain paintings' eyes were said to do. A house tells you what a family values, what they hide, what they've decided to forget. "And what has this one told you?" Cordelia asked, more out of the habit of idle talk than any real curiosity, though something in his stillness made her wait for the answer as though it mattered. "That someone here is very lonely," he said, "and has been for a long time." She did not know then that he meant himself. She thought little more of Mr. Ash that day, occupied as she was with the endless small tyrannies of a great house, the fires, the linens, the silver that Mrs. Fenwick insisted be polished twice weekly, whether or not it had been used, the endless corrections issued by Miss Verity Langham, the Duke's cousin, and the nearest thing Ashworth Hall had to a mistress since the old Duchess's death. Verity was beautiful in the particular, chilled way of women who have never once doubted their own worth, and she had made it known, from Cordelia's first week in the house, that she found the girl's plainness of speech and want of proper deference deeply tiresome. "You forget yourself," Verity told her that afternoon, when Cordelia had answered a question about the household accounts with more directness than the older woman cared for. "A maid who speaks her mind is a maid who does not know her place. I should think you'd have learned that by now." "I beg your pardon, miss," Cordelia said, and lowered her eyes, because the words cost her nothing, and the alternative cost a position she could not afford to lose. But something in her chest went hard and small, the way it always did after such exchanges, a familiar bruise pressed once more. She did not see Mr. Ash watching from the gallery stair, his jaw tight, his hands folded behind his back, with a restraint that cost him more than Verity Langham would ever know he possessed. He had come home to bury his mourning quietly and to consider, at his aunt's relentless urging, which of the season's eligible young women he ought to make his duchess. He had not come home to feel his pulse quicken at the sight of a servant girl defending herself with wit instead of tears. And yet here he was, 3 days into his own house, still wearing his travelling coat, still answering to a false name, watching a maid move through rooms that were legally his, with more grace and more honesty than he had seen from anyone in a London ballroom in a decade. He told himself it was only curiosity. He told himself this for a great many days longer than was strictly true. By the end of that first week, the household had grown accustomed to Mr. Ash's quiet presence, a man who kept odd hours, who asked the gardeners searching questions about drainage and rents, who seemed to know an uncommon amount about the estate's ledgers for a man supposedly new to them, and who had, without anyone quite noticing how it had happened, become someone the lower servants trusted with their small griefs and grievances in a way they never trusted the family above stairs. Cordelia found herself seeking him out in the strange stolen minutes between tasks, though she would not have called it seeking. She told herself it was only that he asked good questions and listened to the answers, a rarity so profound in her experience that it felt almost indecent to enjoy it as much as she did. "You've a sharp eye for a man who claims only to walk the grounds," she said to him one grey afternoon, finding him in the orangery with a ledger she recognized, with a small jolt, as belonging to the estate's rent accounts. "Land agents don't usually trouble themselves with figures like that." "I trouble myself with a great many things I oughtn't," he said, closing the ledger with more haste than the moment required. "Would you think less of me for it?" "I think," she said slowly, "that I don't know what to think of you at all, Mr. Ash. You're not quite a servant, and you're plainly not quite a gentleman, and I've never met a man who sits so exactly between the two." Something flickered across his face, not quite alarm, not quite guilt, but a cousin to both, and he looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Perhaps I am neither," he said. "Perhaps I am only a man who has forgotten, for a little while, which one he's meant to be." She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, because it was the strangest and truest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember, and something in his chest turned over entirely at the sound of it. He had meant to tell her the truth that very evening. He had rehearsed it even, standing at the window of the small steward's room he had taken for himself, rather than sleep in the ducal apartments and risk discovery. "I am not Mr. Ash. I am Alistair Ashworth, Sixth Duke of Rothmere, and this house is mine, and I have been a coward and a liar for a week, and I am sorry, and I do not know how to stop wanting to hear you laugh like that again." But before he could descend the stairs and find her, his aunt's carriage came thundering up the drive, a full day ahead of its expected arrival, and with it came Lady Prudence Ashworth, sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, and utterly unfooled by a false name, and the household exploded into the kind of chaos that only the sudden, correct recognition of a duke can produce. "Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick cried, her hand flying to her heart, and the word rang down the servants' passage like a struck bell, and Cordelia, coming round the corner with an armful of pressed linen, froze in the doorway as though the floor had opened beneath her. Mr. Ash, the quiet man from the hedge, the man who asked good questions, the man whose stillness she had, God help her, begun to look forward to, stood in the front hall in his plain grey coat, and every servant in the house was bowing to him. "Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said again, curtsying so low her knees cracked, "we had no notion. We would have had the rooms made ready. Forgive us, we did not know." "That," Verity Langham said from the stair, her voice sweet with the particular cruelty of the vindicated, "is rather the point, is it not, Alistair? You did not wish to be known." Cordelia stood very still in the doorway, with her linens pressed to her chest like a shield, and felt something in her that had been warming for a week go suddenly, entirely cold. He had let her speak to him as an equal. He had let her mock the family, laugh at the absurdity of great houses, confess small unkindnesses she had suffered at Verity Langham's hands, to him, to the Duke, to the very man whose house it was, whose servants they all were, whose word could end her position with a syllable. He turned then and saw her in the doorway, and whatever he meant to say died in his throat, because her face had gone the pale, closed white of a woman who has just understood that she has been made a fool of by someone she had begun, against all sense, to trust. "Cordelia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name aloud, and it landed in the silence of the hall like a stone through ice. She did not answer him. She turned and walked away, her back very straight, her linens still clutched against her chest, and did not look back, though she heard him call her name a second time, lower, as though it cost him something to say it. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow servant's bed, she shared the room with 2 other maids, and turned the week over and over in her mind, searching for the moment she ought to have known, the tell she had missed, the sign that would have spared her this particular humiliation, because that was what it was, however gently he had done it. He had watched her defend herself against Verity Langham's cruelty. He had watched her scrub grates and haul linens, and speak her small, unguarded thoughts, and all the while he had known precisely who he was, and precisely who she was not, and he had said nothing. She did not know, lying there in the dark, that 2 floors above her, the Duke of Rothmere sat awake at his own writing desk, with his head in his hands, trying and failing to compose a letter he did not know how to begin, because every version of the truth he attempted sounded, on the page, exactly as cheap and cowardly as he now feared it had been. He had told himself it was a test, that he needed, after years of being courted for his title and never once for himself, to know whether a single soul in his world could look at him and see a man rather than a duchy. He had told himself that the deception cost nothing, harmed no one, was owed to no one's honesty but his own weary heart. He understood now, with the particular clarity that only shame provides, that this had been a lie he told himself so that he might feel less like a liar. It had cost Cordelia Wren something. It had cost her the small, guarded trust she had extended to him at considerable risk to herself, in a house where trust extended upward was so rarely returned. He resolved, before the candle guttered out, that he would make it right, not with an apology alone, which would be easy and therefore worth little, but with something that proved, beyond the reach of doubt, that what had passed between them in that week had been real to him. He did not yet know what such a proof would look like. He knew only that he would not rest until he had found it. Word of the Duke's return spread through the county before noon the next day, and with it came the machinery of a great house's obligations, calling cards, invitations, the sudden, urgent attention of every family with an unmarried daughter within 30 miles. Lady Prudence, who had raised her nephew since his mother's death and loved him with a fierce, managing love that left little room for his own preferences, wasted no time in laying her plans upon the breakfast table like a general laying a map. "You will want to settle the matter of a duchess before the year is out," she informed him, buttering her toast with brisk finality. "I have taken the liberty of drawing up a list. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb has £30,000 and excellent teeth. Lady Ophelia Grant is accounted the season's beauty, though I confess I find her conversation thin. And of course there is Verity, who has been devoted to this family for years and who I think you underestimate." "I have no wish to discuss duchesses over toast, Aunt," Alistair said, with a weariness that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the fact that his mind, entirely against his will, kept returning to a maid's white, closed face in a doorway. "You have put it off for 3 years, Lady Prudence said, not unkindly, but with the immovable patience of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "Grief is a season, Alistair, not a lifetime. Your father would want to see the succession secured. I mean to see it done before winter." He did not answer her, because the only answer in his heart was one he could not yet say aloud even to himself, that he had spent 3 years mourning a marriage he had never wanted, to a woman he had been promised to as a boy and lost to illness before the wedding, and that he had come to believe, in the long grey seasons since, that he was no longer capable of wanting anyone at all. And then a maid with tired hands and an unguarded tongue had made him laugh in an orangery, and he had understood, with something between terror and relief, that he had been wrong. He found Cordelia in the linen room that afternoon, folding sheets with a fixed, furious efficiency that told him precisely how little she wished to see him. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway, "and I mean to give it properly, if you will allow me the chance." "I've work to do, Your Grace," she said, not looking up, the title landing with deliberate, icy weight. "I shouldn't like to keep you from more important business." "There is no business more important to me at present," he said, "than making you understand that what I said to you this week, all of it, was true. I did not lie to you about anything but my name." "You lied to me about everything, sir," she said, and now she did look up, and the hurt in her eyes was worse, far worse, than the anger he had braced himself for. "Every word I said to you, I said thinking I spoke to a man with no more power over my situation than I have myself. I told you things, about Miss Langham, about my father, about this house, that I would never have said to the Duke of Rothmere, because the Duke of Rothmere holds my position in the palm of his hand, and I have learned, very thoroughly, what men like that do with such power when it suits them. I would never. You don't know what you would or wouldn't do," she said, and her voice cracked, just slightly, on the words, "Because you have never once had to find out. That is the whole of it, Your Grace. That is the whole of what your name means, and mine does not. You may play at being ordinary for a week, and walk away from it whenever you please. I cannot. I never could." She left him standing in the linen room with an armful of folded sheets and the particular silence of a man who has just been told a truth he cannot argue with, however much he might wish to. He did not go to her again that week. He understood, with the same clarity that had driven him to disguise himself in the first place, that further pursuit would only confirm every fear she held about men of his rank, that they took what they wanted, when they wanted it, and called the taking courtship. Instead, he did something that cost him more in its way than any apology could have. He began to change the house itself, quietly, without announcement, in ways that only someone watching closely would recognize as penance. He instructed his steward to raise the wages of every servant in the house by a fifth, effective immediately, and to see that the change was made without fanfare, so that no one might connect it to any particular grievance. He ordered the fires in the servants' quarters kept lit through the coldest hours of the night, a small comfort no duke before him had troubled to consider. He asked, pointedly and more than once, after the welfare of the staff by name, a habit so unusual in a man of his rank that Mrs. Fenwick remarked upon it to the cook with something like wonder. Cordelia noticed. She could not help but notice. And she hated, faintly, that she noticed, because it complicated the clean, simple anger she had wanted to keep. It was Verity Langham who complicated matters further, and did so with the particular skill of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how to wound without ever raising her voice. "You are aware, I hope," Verity said to Cordelia, cornering her in the still room with the soft, deadly smile she reserved for moments of private cruelty, "that His Grace's attentions to you these past days have been remarked upon below stairs. Servants do talk, you know, whatever airs they give themselves. It would be a great pity if such talk reached Lady Prudence's ears before His Grace has had the chance to explain that it means nothing at all. Men in his position are permitted their diversions, Cordelia. It is only the woman in such a case who is ever made to pay for it." "There is nothing to explain," Cordelia said, though her hands had gone very still upon the shelf of dried lavender before her. "His Grace has no attentions toward me, Miss Langham, diverting or otherwise." "No," Verity agreed, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I don't suppose he does, not in any sense that would survive daylight. But I wonder if you understand, truly, what would happen to you if he were ever fool enough to indulge a passing fancy for a servant girl, and then, as such men always do, come to his senses. There is no position for you after that, Cordelia. No respectable house in the county would take a girl who had been talked of in connection with a duke, however innocently. You would have nothing left but what he chose to give you, and men forget what they have promised a great deal faster than women forget what they have lost." She left the words to settle like frost, and swept from the room, and Cordelia stood alone among the dried herbs with her heart hammering, because she understood, with sick and sudden clarity, that Verity Langham had not spoken out of concern for her welfare at all. She had spoken because she had seen something, in Alistair's face perhaps, or in the quiet, careful way he asked after Cordelia's welfare through the housekeeper, rather than risk seeking her out directly, that frightened her. Verity wanted the dukedom for herself, or failing that, wanted no one else to have what she could not, and she had chosen, with practiced precision, the one weapon most certain to keep Cordelia at arm's length from a man she had already, foolishly, dangerously, begun to miss. It worked, for a time, better than Verity could have hoped. Cordelia began to avoid the wings of the house where she might encounter the Duke, took her meals early to miss the hours he walked the gardens, kept her eyes lowered when duty forced them into the same room. She told herself this was wisdom, not cowardice, that Verity's warning, however cruelly delivered, held an uncomfortable seed of truth. A duke's fancy for a maid was a story with only one ending in every account she had ever heard of such things, and it was never the maid's happiness that survived it. Alistair, for his part, mistook her withdrawal for confirmation of everything Cordelia had accused him of in the linen room, and grew correspondingly more distant himself, though it cost him a great deal more than his composure allowed him to show. He threw himself instead into the business of the estate with a diligence that startled his steward and alarmed his aunt, who had never known her nephew to take such an interest in rent rolls and drainage schemes when there were duchesses to be selected. "You will exhaust yourself over ledgers that any competent man could manage," Lady Prudence told him, watching him pore over accounts late into a third consecutive evening. "I begin to think you use your work to avoid a decision you know you must make." "Perhaps I do," he admitted, and did not elaborate, because the decision he was avoiding had very little to do with Eleanor Whitcomb's excellent teeth, and everything to do with a maid's face in a doorway that he could not, however he tried, put from his mind. It was an accident in the end that brought them together again, the kind of small domestic crisis that great houses produce with tedious regularity, but which, in this instance, unravelled everything Verity Langham had so carefully constructed. A fire broke out in the east wing in the small hours of a bitter November night, sparked by a chimney long overdue for sweeping, one of the many small neglects that had accumulated during years of a grieving Duke's absence. The alarm went up through the house in a confusion of shouting and running feet, and Cordelia, whose room lay nearest the affected wing, was among the first to wake to the acrid bite of smoke in the corridor. She did not think of danger. She thought only of old Mrs. Pruitt, the ailing laundress who slept in the room at the end of that same corridor and who was too infirm these days to move quickly, and Cordelia ran toward the smoke rather than away from it, pounding on doors as she went, hauling the frightened, coughing woman from her bed and half carrying her toward the stair, even as the heat began to press against her back like a living thing. It was Alistair who found them on the stair, half blind with smoke, Mrs. Pruitt's weight nearly buckling Cordelia's knees, and he did not think either, in that moment, of dukedoms or disguises, or the careful distance he had maintained for a fortnight. He simply gathered the old woman into his own arms and shouted for Cordelia to follow him down, and did not draw an easy breath again until they stood together on the frost-white lawn, coughing, soot-streaked, alive. "You might have died," he said to her, when the worst of the chaos had settled into the grim, orderly business of bucket chains and wet blankets, his voice raw with something that was not entirely smoke. "You ran toward the fire, Cordelia. You might have died for a laundress's sake and never thought twice about the cost of it." "She would have died if I hadn't," Cordelia said simply, though her hands, she noticed distantly, would not stop shaking. There wasn't time to think of costs. He looked at her for a long moment in the flame-lit dark, her cap gone, her hair loose and singed at one edge, her face marked with soot and utterly unguarded for the first time in a fortnight, and something in him broke open that he had been holding shut since the linen room. "I have thought of little else these 2 weeks but the cost of what I did to you," he said. "I disguised myself because I wanted, for once in my life, to be looked at as a man and not a title, and in wanting that I made you pay a price I never once considered, because it never occurred to me that I could. That is the whole of my crime, Cordelia, and it is a considerable one, and I do not ask you to forgive it easily, but I will not stand here and let you believe, even for one more hour, that what passed between us was some idle diversion I mean to walk away from. It was the truest week I have lived in 3 years, and it was true because of you, not despite what you did not know." "Miss Langham says," Cordelia began, and stopped, because saying it aloud made it sound, suddenly, exactly as petty and cruel as it was. "I do not care what Miss Langham says," Alistair said, with a sharpness that surprised them both. "I have let that woman manage rooms and menus and my aunt's expectations for 3 years, because grief left me too tired to object, and I see now what that carelessness has cost the people beneath this roof, who have no power to refuse her. That ends tonight. Whatever else is unresolved between us, that much I can promise you plainly." Cordelia did not answer him at once. The lawn was full of shouting servants and the acrid smell of wet ash, and Mrs. Pruitt was being carried toward the gatehouse wrapped in blankets, and it was not, by any measure, a romantic hour, and yet she found herself unable to look away from him, this man who had lied to her about his name and told her, in every other particular, nothing but the truth. "I don't know how to trust a duke," she said finally, low, honest. "I have spent my whole life learning what men with power do to women who have none. I don't know how to unlearn that in a single night, however bravely you spoke just now." "Then I will not ask you to," he said. "I will only ask you to let me prove it to you slowly, in the way that seems least likely to a woman who has been given every reason to doubt it, through what I do, and not through what I say." It was not a resolution. It was not even, quite, a reconciliation. But it was a door left open, where before there had been only a wall, and Cordelia went back into the smoke-damaged house that night with something in her chest that felt, for the first time in a fortnight, dangerously like hope. Verity Langham did not accept the shift in the wind gracefully. She had built her position in that household over years of careful management, of being indispensable to a grieving duke and his managing aunt, and she understood, with the sharp instinct of a woman who has staked everything on a single outcome, that Cordelia Wren's growing steadiness threatened the whole architecture of her plans. She went therefore to Lady Prudence, and did so with the particular skill of a woman who knows how to make her own ambition sound like loyalty.
"I would not trouble you with servants' gossip,"
Verity said, settling into the chair across from Lady Prudence, with an expression of pained reluctance. "Were it not that I fear for Alistair's reputation, and for the good name of this house. There is talk, Aunt Prudence, I use the term you have always permitted me, of an unbecoming attachment between his Grace and one of the housemaids. I have seen it myself. I would not have believed it of him, but grief does strange things to a man's judgment, and I think someone who loves him must speak plainly before the talk spreads further than this house." Lady Prudence, who loved her nephew fiercely and feared scandal above nearly everything else, took the bait exactly as Verity had hoped, and summoned Alistair to her sitting room that same evening with the grim, immovable expression of a woman preparing for battle. "I have heard a report," she said, without preamble, "that you have formed an attachment to a servant in this house. Tell me it is not true, Alistair, and I will hear no more of it. Tell me it is true, and I promise you I will fight it with every resource this family possesses, because I did not raise you to throw away 300 years of this dukedom on an infatuation with a girl who empties your grates." "Her name is Cordelia Wren," Alistair said, very quietly, "and I would ask you not to speak of her that way in my hearing again, Aunt, whatever your fears for this family's name." Lady Prudence's face went pale, then hard. "So it is true." "I do not yet know what it is," he admitted. "I know that I have not felt as I feel in her company in 3 years, and I know that whatever it is, it deserves better than to be discussed, as though it were a stain to be scrubbed from the family linen." "You are the Duke of Rothmere," Lady Prudence said, rising, her voice shaking now with something that was not entirely anger. "You owe this family an heir, a duchess of suitable birth, a marriage that strengthens rather than scandalizes this house. I have watched you disappear into grief for 3 years, Alistair, and I have said nothing, because I understood it. I will not say nothing about this. I forbid it." "You may forbid what you like," Alistair said, and though his voice remained gentle, there was iron beneath it that Lady Prudence had not heard from him since before his mourning began. "I am not a boy for you to manage any longer, Aunt, however much I love you for the years you spent trying. I will choose my own duchess, when I choose one, and I will not choose her on the strength of a family tree alone." It was, in its way, the second reversal of the story, the moment the hero's private tenderness collided openly with the full weight of the world arrayed against it, and did not yield. But the collision was not without cost. Lady Prudence, wounded and frightened for the future of the house she had spent decades protecting, did what wounded and frightened people so often do. She struck out at the nearest, least defended target. Within the week, Cordelia was summoned to the housekeeper's parlour and informed, with Mrs. Fenwick's evident discomfort, that her services at Ashworth Hall were no longer required, and that she was to quit the house by the end of the month. "I am sorry for it, truly," Mrs. Fenwick said, unable to meet Cordelia's eyes. "You have been a good worker, and I have never had cause to complain of you, but the order comes from Lady Prudence herself, and I have no power to refuse it." Cordelia received the news with a calm that surprised even herself, though it cost her everything she had to maintain it until she was alone. She had known, some cold, practical part of her had always known, that this was how such stories ended for girls in her position, not with triumph, but with dismissal, quiet and absolute, executed by people with the power to erase an inconvenience without ever having to look it in the face. She packed her few belongings that same evening with hands that had finally stopped shaking, because there was, in the end, a certain dignity in refusing to beg for what had already been decided. She did not send word to Alistair. She told herself this was pride, and it was in part, but it was also something steadier, a refusal to be the cause of the very rupture between him and his family that Verity Langham had engineered from the start. If she vanished quietly, the trouble vanished with her, and he could return, in time, to the life his position required of him, unburdened by a scandal that would only ever cost her more than it cost him. She was 3 miles down the frozen road toward the village, her small trunk balanced on a hired cart, when Alistair Ashworth came riding after her at a pace that had nearly killed his horse, having learned of her dismissal only an hour before from a stable boy too frightened of Lady Prudence to have said anything sooner. "You would have left without a word," he said, swinging down from the horse before it had properly stopped, his voice ragged with the cold and the ride and something else besides. "You would have simply vanished and let me learn of it from a groom, as though what passed between us these past weeks meant nothing at all." "What was I meant to do?" Cordelia said, and her composure, so carefully held through the packing and the leaving, finally cracked. "Stay and watch you tear your family apart over a housemaid your aunt would rather see in the workhouse than at your side. I have no dowry, Your Grace, no name, no claim on you beyond a fortnight's foolish honesty. I would not have you ruin everything you are for the sake of that." "You are not a fortnight's foolishness," he said, closing the distance between them on the frozen road, snow beginning to fall now in the fading light, "and I am done permitting anyone, my aunt, my cousin, the whole weight of this dukedom, to tell me what I am and am not permitted to want. I did not come after you to offer you a position in my household, Cordelia. I came after you to ask you to be my wife." The word landed between them in the falling snow, like something struck from stone, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You cannot mean that," Cordelia said, though her voice had gone very small. "A duke cannot marry a housemaid. The world would not permit it, whatever you wish." "The world," Alistair said, "will permit exactly what I decide it must, because I have spent 3 years letting other people's expectations dictate the whole of my life, and I find I have no further patience for it. I do not offer you a title because I pity your position, Cordelia. I offer it because I have never once, in 27 years, met a woman who spoke to me as though I were only a man, and then loved the man she found there, without ever once being asked to. That is not a fortnight's foolishness. That is the truest thing that has happened to me since my mother died, and I will not let my aunt's fear, or my cousin's ambition, or your own hard-won caution take it from me without a fight." Cordelia stood in the snow with her small trunk on the cart behind her, and the whole of her carefully built future, a position in some lesser household, a life of quiet, guarded distance from the kind of hope that had only ever cost her before, dissolving before a man on his knees in the frozen road, his hands closed around hers, his eyes asking a question far larger than the one his mouth had already spoken. "I am afraid," she admitted, and it was, perhaps, the bravest thing she had said in the whole of the story. "I am afraid that in a year, or a decade, the world will find some way to make you regret this, and that I will be left with nothing but the memory of having been chosen and then unchosen. I have watched that happen to women before. I do not know how to trust that it will not happen to me." "Then I will spend every year we are given proving to you that it will not," he said, "not with promises, which cost a man nothing, but with the whole of my conduct, every single day, until the fear wears thin enough that you can set it down. That is the only proof I know how to offer, Cordelia. I ask only that you let me begin." She did not answer him at once, but she did not pull her hands from his either, and in the deepening snow that was, for the moment, answer enough. The final reckoning, when it came, arrived not through any grand confrontation, but through the quiet, devastating weight of truth laid plainly before people who had built their power on its absence. Alistair returned to Ashworth Hall with Cordelia beside him, and called his aunt and his cousin together in the long gallery beneath the portraits of dukes and duchesses 3 centuries dead, and told them, without heat, exactly what he intended. "I mean to marry Cordelia Wren," he said, "and I mean to do it publicly, with the full ceremony this house is capable of providing, because I will not have her treated as a secret to be managed, or an embarrassment to be minimized. She saved a servant's life in a burning house, while the rest of us stood shouting on the lawn. She spoke honestly to a man she believed had no power over her, at a time when honesty was the rarest gift anyone in this house had offered me in 3 years. I do not think this dukedom requires a duchess with a longer pedigree. I think it requires one with more courage than most of the women on your list, aunt, have ever been asked to demonstrate." Lady Prudence, who had spent the intervening days in a state of genuine anguish over the whole affair, found herself, in the end, unable to argue with a nephew who had not raised his voice once, and yet had never sounded more certain of anything in his life. It was, perhaps, the sight of Cordelia's steady composure under the weight of the family's collective scrutiny. No tears, no pleading, only a quiet dignity that asked for nothing and yielded nothing, that finally softened something in the old woman's resolve. "You saved Mrs. Pruitt's life," Lady Prudence said finally, addressing Cordelia directly for the first time since the whole affair began, her voice stiff but no longer cold. "I have made inquiries. The account is entirely true. I confess I did not expect to find courage of that kind below stairs, and I am ashamed to say that says more of my own assumptions than of anything you have done." It was not an embrace. It was not even quite an apology, but it was, from a woman of Lady Prudence's pride and position, a considerable concession, and Cordelia received it with the same grace she had brought to every indignity that had come before it. Verity Langham's undoing came more swiftly and less gently once the full account of her interference emerged, the whispered warnings to Cordelia, the manufactured report to Lady Prudence, the years of small cruelties below stairs that had gone unchecked because no one above stairs had troubled to look closely enough to see them. She left Ashworth Hall within the fortnight for a distant relation's house in the north, her ambitions finally, publicly, unrewarded, and the servants who had suffered under her tongue for years spoke of her departure with a relief they were careful not to voice too loudly until she was well and truly gone. The wedding, when it came, was held in the estate's small chapel in the first fall of true winter snow, and Cordelia stood at the altar not as a housemaid elevated by charity, but as a woman the whole county had come, slowly and against considerable resistance, to understand as worthy of exactly the position she was about to hold. Mrs. Fenwick wept openly. Old Mrs. Pruitt, recovered from the fire and fiercely proud, sat in the front pew as though she had personally arranged the entire match, and Alistair, watching Cordelia walk toward him down the frost-bright aisle in a gown of pale blue silk that suited her far better than any grander fashion could have, felt the last of the grief he had carried for 3 years settle, finally, into something quieter and more bearable, not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer the whole of what he was. "I once told you," he said to her, low, as she reached him, "that I disguised myself because I wanted to be looked at as a man and not a title. I did not expect, when I said it, that the woman who managed the feat would also be the one to teach me what it meant to be worth looking at, honestly in return." "I once told you," Cordelia answered, her eyes bright with something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears, "that I did not know how to trust a duke. I find I have grown rather better at trusting a man instead." They were married as the snow fell soft and silent over Ashworth Hall, and the house that had once seemed to Cordelia a place of endless, indifferent grandeur became, in the years that followed, something warmer and more truly hers than she had ever believed a great house could be, not because a title had been bestowed upon her, but because she had been seen, fully and without disguise, by a man who had learned, in watching her from the shadows of his own house, exactly what it meant to be truly known. And in the mornings that came after, when the fog still clung low over the hollow and the house had not yet properly woken, it was not uncommon for the servants to find the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere walking the frost-bright lawns together before the first bell, two figures moving easily through the grey light of dawn, in no particular hurry to be seen as anything grander than exactly what they were.